Hey, we're going to do a brake job, a front brake pad and rotor change. This is for a 1996 Honda CRV import. It's probably the same thing as a 97 to 2001. It's going to go through some of the tools. You'll need a wire brush to clean off the faces of the where the rotor sits or faces. A file, some ratchets, maybe a braking bar. In this case here, a 17 millimeter long wrench I use. 17 millimeter socket, 19 millimeter socket to take the wheel lugs the wheel off. You're going to need one of these straps here to strap up the caliper onto the spring once it's all cleaned off. Set of pliers. I use a little awl type screwdriver to make sure that the seals are, the face of the seals is against the caliper and it's not all crimped up. Screwdriver. Here's the new brake pads. Some brake cleaner, brake lubricant, synthetic brake lubricant, some anti-seize compound. I've got another smaller brush that I use for cleaning off the faces where the brake pads go, where they seat, and to clean the holes where the sliding pins go through the threads. I use one of these brushes. Also a tool to push back the piston. So the first thing that I do when I do it, after I've got it all jacked up and the wheels off, is, depending on whether or not throughout the life of the brake pad somebody has added brake fluid, I like to take the cover off of the master cylinder. That way when you push the piston back, fluid doesn't go all over or you don't ruin the seals in the master cylinder. So I've got it off here. Alright. So let's start by taking off the caliper. Like I say, I use a 17 millimeter. I've already loosened these off, so just going to take it off, undo it. You can use sockets for this if you want, especially to break them loose. Or like in this case, I use the long wrench. Gives you more leverage. Okay, so I like to take the bottom one out first. What I do is I clean off this silicone and graphite on the threads. Make sure everything's okay. Make sure the threads are okay. If they're not, replace them. And I just set it aside. And that there is just a tray. It's a magnetic tray so that things don't get lost. Kind of holds things in there. Alright, so once they're all cleaned off and you've looked at them and everything looks fine, just set them aside for now. Next thing I do is pull off the caliper. Pull off the caliper, make sure that everything looks fine. The boots, I like to clean them up with this little brush. It's a good idea to, when you're cleaning this stuff, to spray them off first. Get all the brake dust off. Not good for you. Just cleaning that off. All right. Wipe this area here where the threads are. Wipe it off with a rag. I like to take these brushes, put the brushes through here. Make sure there's no metal pieces that can actually hurt the threads, damage the threads of the sliders. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is I use one of the brake pads. Brake pad closest to the piston. That way you don't damage the piston. Use this special tool here that pushes back the piston. And just crank it in very slowly, gently, making sure that everything's okay. Okay, it'll bottom out and your piston's now seated. I like to spray it off again, clean off this area. Now, one thing that you don't want to do is just hang the or let the caliper hang by itself. So what I do is I like to use one of these straps, as I was saying, and just tie it off like that. Okay. So use a screwdriver and break away this other pad. Sometimes they're a bit tough to get out of here. Just getting a stronger screwdriver. And a small hammer. There we go. Sometimes it takes a little bit of force. Get those off of there. I like to remove these seats, as I call them. Clean them up, make sure everything's all, the faces of them are okay. Now, because we're going to be replacing the rotor, I have to take these two bolts off over here. Right here. And there's one at the top. right there. So we're going to take those off. Okay. Again, you can use a socket and a ratchet if you'd like, or a braking bar. I've got this special long wrench here that I use. So once we get these loose, now some of these, depending on the car that you're working on, some of these can be the same size, and one might be longer, one might be shorter. So just have a look at it as you're taking it off, just to make sure. In this case, they're both the same. Okay, once we get the cradle off, I like to take this wire brush and clean these mating surfaces off here. Right here, here, and the same thing on the other side. Here and here. That's where the brake pads actually sit on the hardware. So just be careful that you don't hit these little rubber boots here. They most of the time they do come in a hardware kit, but you don't want to prematurely put a hole in them. Okay, I like to spray this off, clean it off. Okay, once that's done, clean these little rubber boots. Get all the dirty silicone out of there. Okay, just set that aside. Next thing we're going to do is take off the rotor. Now, most of the time the rotors have two screws here that actually hold the rotor on when you first put it on. It's much easier and it's not flopping around all the time. If you have to use I believe it's an 8mm bolt to separate from the hub the rotor, these are the two screws here, where you would put a 8mm bolt, I believe it is, put it in and tighten it down simultaneously, and it'll actually separate the rotor from the hub. Hopefully we don't have to do that. In this case here, no, we don't. So we just take it off. This one here is pretty much shot, because if you put a gauge on here, you'd find that there is quite the large lip here. It's worn down. Same with on the back side. So we're going to replace them. Okay, the next thing that I like to do with the same wire brush is I like to clean this face of the hub. It just gives a smoother surface for the rotor to seat against, and it cleans it up. You can also use if you have a drill, you can get abrasive discs that you can use to clean this area here. And I'm also concerned about this area here, this lipped area here. So what we're going to do now, after we clean it off, spray it off. Gotta get some more brake cleaner. Clean it off here in these areas. I like to give it a good spray all the way around, just get all the unwanted material out of there. Is I like to take anti-seize compound and to put it on this face here. For the next time, so that the rotor, you don't have any issues getting it off. And I put a little bit here on the face. Okay. Out of the way. Now, here's the new rotor. And again, if we did have the screws to hold the rotor in place once we put it on the hub, one would go here, one would go here. Sometimes, now this is only a 4-bolt hub. Sometimes you have a 5-bolt, and sometimes these are in a certain position where you have to make sure that with them, when you put it on, and you have to line up the holes on the hub. So they could be on either side. In this case here, there's only 4 bolts, and it just slides on. So if we did have the 2 screws, I would put one here and one here. But I don't have the screws, so we'll leave it like that. Now that we've got the hub, or the rotor on, I'm going to put the cradle, as they call it, back on. But first, before I do that, I want to clean the hardware up. I use that little brass brush. Clean off these surfaces. If you're putting new hardware on, of course you don't have to do this. My motto is, if it's not broken, don't try and fix it. And if you don't have to put new hardware on or spend the money on new hardware, why bother? Save yourself a few bucks. And these, they just clip back on the cradle. Oop. Just like that. I'm going to make sure these little tabs are on the inside. Those little tabs are right here. One there. And right there. And it's seated properly. Okay. Do the other side. This particular set of hardware, they're both the same, top and bottom. Some I've done, and oops, that went flying. Some I've done before, and they're actually different on the top and the bottom. So you just got to make sure that you take them off and you put them in their respective spots. Okay. So again, make sure the little tabs go on the inside of the cradle, and just push it down. Make sure all these are seated properly. Here, here, and there. That's it. Now, before we put that on, what I like to do is I like to put a little bit of this silicone on these areas here where the brake pads are going to, where they meet, or they mate. Some people use anti-seize compound. I like the silicone. It doesn't wash off. And I do this beforehand because if you try and do it after you get it on, and I'll show you, after you get it on, you could get this silicone all over the rotor, and it's something I don't really want to do. So just a light coat. Okay. The other thing that I like to do is put a light coat on the last few threads of these bolts of the anti-seize compound. Just a little bit. Just to help get them off, so you can get these bolts off the next time you do the brakes. Okay. So, you just put it on the inside here and just line it up. With the hole, if we can get it here. There we go. And just snug her down. Don't want to put it too tight because you want to be able to move the bottom. Get the bottom in there. Okay. Now, when it comes to these two bolts, because I have had one of these things come off while I was driving, I like to make sure that they're on fairly tight. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put the brake pads on. There's two different ones. One with a brake wear indicator and one without. Okay? What I do is I put a little bit of extra lubricant on these surfaces here. This is a silicone. It works better than, as I was saying, it works better than anti-seize compound. And you want to put a little bit there so that the brake pads, there's no that they actually slide properly. Okay, just like that. This one here, here. This one here. You got to kind of clip them in there like that. Okay? One thing that I forgot to mention earlier on when we first started is that wherever the cradle is, or the caliper, you want it facing outwards so that it's easy to get at everything here. Okay? So now we're going to unhook this, get rid of that, and what we're after is this surface here mating up flush with this surface here on the boots. So what I do is I kind of like just position it like that, and don't worry if it doesn't happen right away. Just let it sit there like that. Be careful that the caliper doesn't fall. We're going to take the top slider. We're going to put some silicone on it. Just like this. A liberal amount of silicone. You want these things to slide. You don't want them to seize up. Okay, there's already some anti-seize compound on there, and this one goes at the top. Just slide it in and thread it down. Just get it started for now. Okay, do the same thing with the bottom one. Put some silicone on here. And this is automotive silicone. It is not silicone that you put around the windows. Okay. We're going to put this one in. You want to make sure that this mating surface on this boot is okay. So just use your little awl and just rub it lightly like that. Put this guy on here. Tighten her down. Some sort of pick and awl. That works good with this. You just got to be careful that you don't damage the little boot. It's just a dust boot. Okay, and I grabbed a different wrench, a gear wrench. Oops, 17. I'm just going to tighten this guy down like this. Tighten it down. Same with the bottom one. Just gonna wind it down. There we go. Make sure that that's any excess that's squeezed out. Wipe it off. And that's it. Now what I like to do also is just give the rotor one last squirt, one last clean, caliper, both inside and outside. Okay. Now what we can do is I'm going to have my assistant here hold this like this, and I'm going to, very importantly, go and put the car in the accessory position. Start it. Don't start it. Just in the accessory position and pump the brake until the brakes seat. Okay, after we pump the brakes to make sure that this is seated, we're going to go over here and we're going to make sure that the fluid level in the master cylinder is okay, which it is. The car's on a bit of a tilt right now because it's jacked up, but we just put the cap back on and that's it. And just make sure that there's no leaks on either side when changing the brake pads. One thing that I should stress is that when you change the pads, you change both sides, not just one side, it has to be both sides. I've seen people change the rotors, one rotor on one side and not on the other, but the pads must be changed. I like to change things in pairs. Pads and rotors, or just pads. Anyways, thanks for watching, and see you again next time.